Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Closer Look, the show dedicated to bringing you the facts. We ask the questions no one else will, and we get the answers that no one else can. I'm Aravana Apia. Thanks so much for joining us. Freedom. It's a revolutionary concept often viewed through the lens of history. We have been and continue to be regaled with centuries-old stories of rebellions and revolts led by our ancestors. Their global battle for the emancipation of millions of black and brown people across the globe not only signaled an end to the oppression of an entire ethnicity of people, but forced the vanguard of the day to rethink the economic structures that had been built on the backs of the enslaved. For the newly liberated, it meant assuming a new personal and national identity while attempting to hold on to the traditions, beliefs, and systems which enslavers sought to strip from them altogether. Years after the abolition of the slave trade, those of us in the delegation of the melanated have managed to eke out some freedoms for ourselves: the right to vote, the right to an education, the right to live a life free of discrimination. And yet, the question of whether we are truly free remains unanswered all these years. Tonight, as we ponder the ideals of freedom, I put to you that the journey started by our ancestors and their abolitionist allies is still not done, because freedom is not automatic. It was never meant to be. It was former U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt who said that in its truest sense, freedom cannot be bestowed. It must be earned. The road to emancipation, freedom, self-determination, and self-actualization is long and arduous, with many forks and many crossroads. That journey has made some of us weary, discouraged, and disillusioned. In fact, I dare say that some of us have lost sight of the end goal. But what is the end goal? The upcoming Emancipation Day holiday will hopefully give Bahamians the opportunity to reflect on the state of our collective freedom and then be prepared to take the necessary steps to secure true emancipation. Tonight, we'll take a closer look into the history of the abolition of slavery and the Bahamas' role in the region. Later on in the show, we'll be joined by Member of Parliament for the historic Fox Hill constituency, the Honorable Fred Mitchell, who will walk us through some of that history and talk about the ongoing journey toward true emancipation. Stay with us. The conversation begins on the other side of the break.
I'm proud to be Bahamian simply because of the uniqueness of the Bahamian culture and everything that we represent as a people. It doesn't matter where you go in the world, you will never find a group of people that speak like we do, that cook like we do, that express themselves in the way that Bahamians do. You can't find any music that's like Bahamian music, or any group of people rather that dance like Bahamians dance when it comes to Junkanoo or anything. And like I said with the people, Bahamians are resilient. We're a strong group of people. We bounce back, and in times of need especially, we come together. So I think all of that makes me proud to be Bahamian.
Welcome back. You're watching A Closer Look. I'm Aravana Apia. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. Now, despite being absent from many of the regional histories surrounding the transatlantic slave trade, the Bahamas' role in the eventual abolition of slavery cannot be overlooked. Our country's historical connection to that ancestral African heritage has helped shape our national identity. This week, I sat down with Jim Lawler, a historian and author of the book From Africa to the Bahamas, and his daughter, UB history professor, Dr. Lisa Feller. Let's take a closer look. The road to the abolition of the slave trade and the eventual emancipation of enslaved people did not occur overnight. That's according to author Jim Lawler. In his book, From Africa to the Bahamas, the historian chronicles the events leading up to the landmark event and notes that while abolition was in fact on the minds of people across the United Kingdom, Spain, and France, it would be a calculated maneuver on the part of Britain's William Wilberforce that got the legislation passed.
William Wilberforce introduced a bill to Parliament around about 1790. At that time, the Parliament was full of absentee plantation owners from the Caribbean and the Americas. And the Parliament was so stacked that his proposal was refused. He did several over the years, refused. But by 1807, the Parliament was now full of businessmen and industrialists, and so they were more sympathetic. Plus, there was many petitions from the people in Britain to abolish. So he actually, by a trick, abolished the slave trade.
That move did not, however, mean absolute freedom, as slavery continued unabated in countries like the United States, Cuba, and Brazil. It was here in the Bahamas, however, that these enslaved men and women would receive their freedom.
The British Navy were intercepting slave ships and bringing Africans to the Bahamas, where the Nassau Vice Admiralty Court freed them. And so that was the first abolition and emancipation.
After 1834, more than 4,000 liberated Africans would settle here in the Bahamas, and that ancestral connection is still very much alive in those communities today.
So with those 4,000, then they created Joshua Town, Nango Town, Burnside Town, Congo Town.
While the role of the Bahamas is often excluded from regional histories, Dr. Lisa Feller, a professor of history at the University of the Bahamas, says she's hoping to see renewed focus placed on the critical role that the country played in this era of history.
I would really love to look more at our sea routes and everything that actually are so important, were so important at the time. They were part of this maritime highway that it's just not looked at enough. And if Bahamian people, if we could really take a claim to that and really realize how much a part of the region we are, historically at least, if not geographically, I think there would be a new kind of pride that could come about.
When we come back, we continue our historical conversation with veteran educator and native Fox Hillian, Dr. Jacinta Higgs, who helps us navigate life as a people post-emancipation. A closer look continues after this.
I am proud to be a Bahamian, because we have some of the most creative people in the world. The world marks the manner of our bearing. In our music, in our actors, in our entertainers, in our food culture, and in our history. We are a people that are given to the creative arts, to being environmental stewards, to taking care of what we have been given, which is more than sand, sun, and sea. We are a people of resilience and resourcefulness. That's why I'm proud to be a Bahamian.
With a better understanding of our country's history and our country's relationship to the emancipation era, we're now in a better position to make the decision to move forward on our journey. As part of our deep dive into the impact of emancipation on our collective consciousness, we sat down with educator and advocate of the African diaspora in the Bahamas, Dr. Jacinta Higgs. Take a look. For resident Fox Hillian Dr. Jacinta Higgs, the concept of emancipation remains an incomplete story. Higgs, who sat down with the A Closer Look team this week, says for her and many like her, emancipation for Black and brown people happened in proclamation only.
It happened in terms of a proclamation in 1833, but it did not carry over in the old ancient African principles of true liberation and emancipation, which means, first of all, your spirit.
Higgs, who is also a veteran educator and advocate, notes that, among other things, reparations for the descendants of freed and liberated Africans should include funding for education, but more importantly, embrace what she says should be the abandonment of colonial education structures.
Here I studied how colonial education strategically erased our African memory. They were brilliant how they did it. They did it in the foods, they did it in the clothing, they did it in our speech, our language, they did it in our culture, in the bush medicine, so it's very strategic. They did it in government, law, and politics. And so therefore, in here, I was required to, in order for fulfillment for this process, to talk about intergenerational transmission. And that means, how do you strategically now introduce ancient teachings?
Well, with both Emancipation Day and Fox Hill Day on the horizon, Dr. Higgs shared with us her hope for all Bahamians of African descent living across the Bahamas.
The earthiness of our ancestors, let us remember them with authenticity. That's what I wanted to take away.
Powerful words indeed. But we're not quite done just yet. When we return from the break, Fox Hill Member of Parliament, the Honorable Fred Mitchell, joins me in studio for a candid conversation on the state of our collective freedom and the role his constituency plays in helping the nation navigate that history.
I'm proud to be a Bahamian for so many reasons. Our culture is so strong, our music, our food, everything is just wonderful. And guess what? Nowhere, no one can compare to our beautiful waters. We are the Bahamas, and I am proud to be a Bahamian.
Welcome back. You're watching A Closer Look. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Aravana Apia. And joining me in studio now is the Member of Parliament for the Fox Hill constituency, Minister Fred Mitchell.
Good.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Okay, so Minister, we've been talking a lot about emancipation, the lead up to that historic event, what was happening at that time. In your estimation, why should Emancipation Day be something that Bahamians should be concerned about and want to celebrate?
Well, the population of the Bahamas is mainly African-based descent. And for much of our history, there's been legal discrimination and then social discrimination against people of African descent. And that marker, the 1st of August 1834, is one of the historic markers where the assertion, the affirmation of the humanity of African people was affirmed in the Bahamas, or the Bahama Islands as it then was. So in order to reaffirm our humanity, to remember where we came from, it's very important to have that context about where we are. And you know, we still have these problems of self-esteem. Dark skin is still almost a curse in this country. You know, people trying to bleach their skin and all of those kinds of things. So there needs to be a push all the time for this reaffirmation of those of African descent. And then, of course, the question of the larger issues of freedom are important, that each person has human dignity and should be free to exercise their life the way they want to as a free people.
You spoke about the reaffirmation of people of African descent. What other elements do you think were really brought to the forefront with the abolition of slavery, the Abolition Act of 1834, and then the full emancipation of liberated Africans at that time?
Well, you know, we're still struggling with the legacy of that act, because the act while it abolished slavery and so-called freed the slaves, the only persons who got compensated for it were the owners of the slaves. And I think it's just in recent times that the British government finished paying off the loans from that period. So the British government borrowed money, translated into today's money, it's billions of dollars, which they paid the slave owners for the slaves. The slaves and their descendants never got any compensation for the free labor. And these societies were built, not only the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, but throughout the Caribbean. This was the richest source of capital, the Caribbean region, for the United Kingdom.
Right.
And there's been no compensation. So the question today still is, how do we compensate the descendants of the slaves for that discrimination?
Right.
And that's why the issue of reparations is being discussed so loudly today.
Okay, let's talk about reparations, because I think when people hear the term reparations, they think only money. Let's talk about what that could look like for descendants of Africans living in the Bahamas and elsewhere in the region.
Well, it could mean money, but it also means restorative justice in one sense. Let's say what happened at Georgetown University is one such example, where, and Cambridge University, where their endowments were actually supported by slave labor and the investment in slaves. So what has happened is those universities are now offering bursaries and scholarships to the descendants of African people so they can access the university. That's one example of it. There are a couple of court cases which are now working their way through the systems in the CARICOM region and may even emerge into the United States to deal with these issues. But you see it in the social discrimination which exists in many of these countries. And there needs to be a whole job in public education about the value of human beings so that it never happens again.
I think something that you noted about access to education, that has been something that's sort of been at the forefront of a lot of the conversations surrounding reparations, because education is one way that people are able to lift themselves out of poverty, out of you know, their current situations. Do you think that there's enough focus being put on that locally?
The reparations issue has gotten caught up in some difficult arguments here, because the society here tends to say, oh, that happened a long time ago. Why are we concerned about it? But if you look at the continuum of our history and trace it right back, you'll see that even after slavery was legally abolished, there was in fact social discrimination, and that social discrimination still exists today. Even though we are supposedly free, it still exists today. And it exists in little ways like this. You walk into a bank and you want to get a loan, and you're a certain skin color, and you go there and they look at you a certain way. Someone else of a different hue goes into the bank and gets a walkthrough. That kind of discrimination exists across the world, not just the Bahamas.
Right.
And until this kind of internal discrimination, until that we are able to strike that down, we must continue to discuss and talk about this issue.
Let's go back to the abolition of slavery. I know there were so many people who were fighting for you know, the emancipation of black and brown people. Can you talk about, as far as Bahamians are concerned, who are some of the people that we should look to and celebrate as leading the call for emancipation?
Well, I think the person who most comes to mind is the slave Pompey, who led a revolt, was a slave in Exuma, in Steventon. There is a monument which is built to his memory in Exuma today. And he was going to be, with his mates, transferred summarily to a plantation in San Salvador. Okay. Didn't want to go. And so they left, led a revolt, came to Nassau. They were punished for it, and punished severely, but goes down in history as one of the revolts against the chattel slavery of Africans in this country. And there is a telling of history in the Bahamas that tries to portray this as some kind of benign system. But the dehumanizing effects of it are throughout our history. For people like Black Dick, poor Black Kate, all are throughout our history examples of how there's systematic discrimination against people of African descent. And if people want to read an authoritative work on this, read Sean McQueenie's Breaching the Gates, which was published perhaps 2 years ago, which tells of what happened after slavery was abolished and the efforts to prevent people of color from getting into the House of Assembly. He tells the story of after the Haitian Revolution, for example, people were the power structure in this country were frightened that the revolution was going to spread here. So there were laws passed banning gatherings in the streets of more than a few people, and they changed the laws to define whether you were black or white. And some people went to bed one night, they were white, and the next morning they found out they were black because they had so-called 1 ounce of black blood in them. So these things existed in the Bahamas, and that legacy is what we're still fighting today.
You spoke about Sean McQueenie's writings on this subject. Do you think, in speaking to Dr. Feller about slavery and the history, she mentioned something that I took note of, which is that the Bahamas is not really mentioned prominently in the regional histories, the regional accounts. And she suggested that, maybe there needs to be a revamping of that to really highlight the role that the Bahamas played, not just as a transit, but sort of in the abolition and the eventual, ending of slavery. Do you agree?
Well, one of the things I want to tell is the story is always told, former Prime Minister Perry Christie used to always say, the tale of the hunt is always told by the hunter. And the problem is that's the way history is written. Yeah. The fact is that slaves revolted against slavery, and it was the slaves themselves that brought about freedom, not the benign work of people or the work of people in these developed countries who took advantage. Yes, they had the legal responsibility, but slavery was something which the slaves continuously revolted against and brought about their freedom. And as regards this country and the stories, Dr. D. Gale Saunders, who was our first archivist and was just honored with an Order of the Bahamas, has written half a dozen, if not more, books about the history of slavery in this country, the abolition, and the systematic discrimination in our politics. Another seminal work is Colin Hughes's book, Race and Politics in the Bahamas. Very important. So the story is told by some people.
We've talked a lot about what the abolition of slavery accomplished, what the emancipation of African descendants accomplished. In what way do you think the Emancipation Proclamation is still unfinished business for descendants of Africans?
Well, we have this social job to do. As I said, the social discrimination still exists. I was told a story by a teacher who is light-skinned down in one of our islands, and he was trying to encourage his students who were dark-skinned that this was not something which they should be preoccupied. And he said after the class was over, one of the students came up to him and said, "Now, Mr. So-and-so, you like being light-skinned, hey?" So that stuff is still ingrained in people. The other day I was shocked to hear one of the 21-year-olds that sort of hang around me say that so-and-so has good hair. So these expressions are still culturally ingrained in the Bahamas. And so we have that battle to continue to fight. And the battle for economic empowerment is also caught up in the classism and racism of the history of the Bahamas, which we constantly have to fight. And it is a very uncomfortable subject to talk about race, very, very uncomfortable, but it's a discussion which must be had.
In terms of that economic empowerment, a lot of slave owners became extremely wealthy off the backs of the enslaved. And like you said earlier, that has never sort of balanced itself out. in your estimation, how do we actually make inroads to address that imbalance?
Well, the government has a role to play. And this is why all of these transfer payments, and in the United States it's called affirmative action, which is to try and go backwards and compensate for the discrimination and losses which existed in the past. That is something which we have to look at here in the Bahamas. We have majority rule here. The government has been seeking to find ways to broaden the economic base, to increase the pie by using a combination of transfer payments, special loans for people so that they can get a jump up and broaden the economic base. So from a combination of all of those things, you know, I was very interested in some discussions that Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and a good friend, and he was responding to the criticism which these developed societies have about our societies and the level of debt which we've taken on. And he was reminding us that when Jamaica became independent in 1962, I think the literacy rate may have been less than 10%. So the government, when they came in and were so-called handed this state by the British, they had to do a lot of work to try and bring the population up, and that required borrowing money. So there's no surprise that these societies are in debt, just as we are in debt now as a result of what, 50% of our debt, national debt, is due to climate issues, which are not of our making. So there's a lot of unfairness in this, and this is why public education is so important, because there's a tendency for the slaves and their descendants to be blamed for their condition, and that we have to debunk.
As we prepare to celebrate and observe Emancipation Day, what is your hope for the country as we pause to sort of reflect and you know, chart a way forward? What is your hope?
Well, first, in a social sense, I hope everybody has a good time and, you know, come up to Foxhill for Emancipation Day. And the second Tuesday in August is Foxhill Day. And watch the climbing of the Greasy Pole, participate in the Junkanoo. And I hope that that the 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds can have fun and not fight. I mean, there's no reason for it. Just enjoy yourselves. There's no reason for it. So I hope that is. But behind it all, I hope that there is a sense, a reaffirmation of our heritage, of our humanity, and that there is a discussion again about where we are on these issues and how far we have to go. The poet says we have miles to go before we sleep. Miles to go.
Well, that's all the time we have with the minister tonight. Thank you so much for being here, Minister.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We have more of a closer look after the break. Stay with us.
I'm proud to be a Bahamian because of the people.
The struggle for freedom and liberation is a part of who we are as a people. It's woven into the very fabric of our collective DNA. The journey to attain that freedom in its purest form is still very much at the heart of our continued development as a global society. By virtue of those who came before us, we have been afforded an incredible opportunity, the opportunity to reshape our collective destiny by honoring the sacrifices of the past. Now, while our physical forms are for the most part free, we must move toward a mindset shift if true emancipation is to be attained. Bob Marley once told us, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. This Emancipation Day, let that be the goal. August 1st shouldn't just be another day off, but one of reflection, introspection, and redirection. Till next time, Bahamas. I'm Arabina Pia. This has been A Closer Look. Good night, everyone.